Unlike the other dominions, European South Africans never attained demographic superiority, resulting in a relatively anonymous colony and war experience. For the dominions with European demographic superiority, the war was an instrument to assimilate the indigenes, while for South Africa, where blacks and natives outnumbered the Europeans, the war was used to experiment with policies of pre-apartheid segregation. At the creation of the Union of South Africa on the 21st of May 1910, natives outnumbered Europeans by a ratio of at least 4 to 1, and regulations matched this threat. Both Boers, Afrikaners, and British forces employed blacks in large numbers, over 100,000 in total, during the Second Anglo-Boer War, which solidified British hegemony in South Africa. Former Boer General Louis Botha became the first Prime Minister in 1910 and the Minister of Native Affairs in 1912, and he held this post until his death in 1919. He was succeeded as Prime Minister by his fellow Boer veteran Jan Christian Smuts, who served as Botha's Minister of Defence from 1912 onwards. The Union Defence Act of 1912 made all European males ages 17 to 60 eligible for military service in times of war, and obligated those 17 to 25 to undergo training. The clause excluded non-Europeans from wartime service in combat capacity and from peacetime training. However, the clause could be changed in a majority vote in Parliament, and most importantly, a qualifying condition safeguarding the opportunities of the clause to be repealed summarily in times of war. Given the black involvement on both sides of the Boer War, Article 7 was clearly crafted to deny blacks immediate combat status, but enable, if required, their service in a variety of non-combat roles. Aware of the ethnic tensions in his country and with war imminent on the 1st of August 1914, Botha released an official statement regarding the hostilities in Europe and the natives in South Africa. There is, however, little probability at present of any trouble which seriously affect the natives. The government therefore trusts that the natives will display their customary loyalty to Her Majesty and the Union of South Africa by going quietly about their daily work and paying no heed to other rumours, resting assured that the government will carefully watch over their interests. Daar is een gat wat waarschijnlijk die onblink van een problem, which die natural is take move and believing. That regarding vostos dos die related no guben liking, Lord Joyesti Torresi Majesty und die Union of South Africa, so we dosa in Ghana un hula daskika. Work is gonna would upi in Ghani, what restore that die regarding who belostonging sa homusin. There was no anonymous stance with the black and coloured populations concerning the war. The reaction of the black and coloured leaders to the war and to the coinciding Boer rebellion, however, was one of support and allegiance to the Union and the King, with immediate offers of monetary and troop contributions. The Union government accepted no official offers from native political organisations. The black and coloureds were active in both German South-West Africa and the short-lived Boer rebellion. The use of armed blacks on both sides during the rebellion was similar to that of the Boer War. Given the short duration of the field Boer insurrection, the employment of armed blacks received scant attention outside the official circles. Aside from the usual public rumours circulating about the ever-present fear of a black revolt, in all 3,546 natives served in non-combat roles as carriers, drivers and animal packing leaders with the Union forces during the German South-West African campaign. During 1915 and 1916, Dominion forces expanded and became a key component in the fighting strength of the British Expeditionary Force on the Western Front and at Gallipoli. The escalating overall strength of Allied armies was accompanied by the immediate need for service and support of auxiliary troops, such as Labour battalions, Forestry Corps and Pioneer battalions. On the 8th of October 1915, all Governor-Generals and Administrators of British dominions and colonies received a confidential memorandum from the Canadian-born Colonial Secretary Andrew Boer Law, probing the creation of units of Dominion indigenes. 10 days later, on the 18th of October, Boer Law issued a memorandum solely for the 5 dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Newfoundland, specifically addressing the question of raising native troops, especially in South Africa, for imperial service. 10 days later, on the 18th of October, Boer Law issued a memorandum solely for the 5 dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Newfoundland, specifically addressing the question of raising native troops, especially in South Africa, for imperial service. The Union of South Africa is one of the self-governing dominions which needs to consider this connection. No proposal for training natives upon a large scale is likely to be accepted by the government nor the British or the Dutch inhabitants of the Union. As a return after peace is a large body of trained and disciplined black men who create obvious difficulties and might seriously menace the superiority of the whites. It is conceivable, assuming the Union government would consent, that the corps, at most a few thousand natives, might be trained and sent to the Persian Gulf to release the First Nation troops now serving there. The news of native South Africans outside the Union's African campaigns was hesitant by the demands of imperial government in late 1915 and early 1916. In October 1915, the imperial government specifically addressed the issue of losing native labourers in non-African theatres via the aforementioned Memorandum of the 18th of October 1915. The memorandum was also influenced in the formation of the South African native units for East Africa. While the imperial government had contemplated raising black South African units for European service since October 1915, any proposition forwarded by the War Council was futile without the consent of the wary Union government. In June 1916, Botha was propositioned regarding black labourers to be neutralised in France. There was a serious labour shortage, estimated to be about 60,000 men in Allied forces, which had been heightened by the effects of the Somme offensive. It was thought that black South Africans could enter the labour pool as well as train up Europeans and white colonials for combat. Upon receipt of the proposal, the conclusion was reached that the war necessities are paramount and that this experiment was given into effect, which required careful supervision and selected instruments. For the point of view of the Union, the sociology of this experiment was an important one. There were three primary reasons why Botha agreed to dispatch a contingent in native labourers to France. There are three primary reasons why Botha agreed to dispatch a contingent of native labourers to France. First, Botha ensured that he had direct command and control of the unit through his position of the Minister of Native Affairs, chiefly via the efforts of Native Affairs Secretary Edward Downer and the Chief Clerk Godfrey A. Godley. Given the fact that Botha agreed to the experiment without referring to the matter of the House of Assembly, which opposition was bound to occur, stipulating however that the British would shoulder the complete cost of the contingent. Second, Botha was protecting South African interests. He was concerned that the imperial government could circumvent the Union by recruiting blacks from other surrounding protectorates of Bechuanaland, Botswaniland and Swaziland. Botha recognized that the British officers in command of the local natives instead of the more racially attuned South Africans could undermine South African influence in the region. Lastly, a refusal to comply would, by extension, damage South African claims to the converted German Southwest Africa during peacetime negotiations, which was kind of South African interests. The force would be comprised of 10,000 natives from across the Union, from Botswanaland to Swaziland. The plan was 5 battalions of 2,000 men each, including Europeans, with 1 European sergeant to 60 natives. In total, each battalion had 60 Europeans in administration duties or commanding positions. Despite the patriotic appeal and pressing recruitment drive, enlisted did not meet expectations. By January 1917, the initial 10,000 labourers had been recruited. However, during the same month, the imperial government urgently asked the Union to refurnish a total of 40,000 labourers of the South African native labour contingent. The Union response was simply that, although they cannot have a stage guaranteed to supply 40,000, we will gladly do everything in our power to meet the request of the Army Council. During 1917, recruitment efforts and methods accelerated and broadened with little success. There were multiple reasons for the lack of volunteers, but Albert Grantley accurately pointed out, they are all traceable to one underlying theme, the basic mistrust of the white man. In addition to requests for labour, the imperial government asked for native combats to be used on the Western Front. On the 28th of March 1917, South African Governor-General Lord Sir Charles Buxton received a cable from the War Office, desirous for replacing white personnel in certain artillery units in France by 18,300 native personnel to enlist in the South African or the Indian for the duration of the war. Buxton's detailed response alluded to all racial, social, political and military realities currently in South Africa. The issue was never given no further consideration and the War Office did not bring it up again. The 1st Battalion of the South African Native Labour Corps, or the SANLC, arrived in Le Havre on the 20th of November 1916, followed by the 2nd on the 10th of December. The South African Native Labour Contingent, or Corps, was housed in segregated camps in Le Havre, Ront, Depré and Abercourt. The SANLC was housed in segregated camps in Le Havre, Ront, Depré and Abercourt, segregated hospitals in Depré and Boulogne, and they were also formed with native orderlies. In March 1917, Colonel S.M. Pitchard issued all white officers and administrators of the South African Labour Corps an appendix to note for officers of the Labour Company of the South African native labourers. Members of the SANLC were not allowed to leave the camp unless escorted by white personnel. They were not allowed to visit local shops, pubs, businesses, or private dwellings without white escort, nor were they allowed to be in the possession of alcohol or daga, marijuana, or weed within the camps. They had actually brought daga with them from South Africa, so it's all good. Unauthorized personnel and locals were not allowed within the camps, and interactions with locals, especially women, and other labor units were to be minimized to avoid familiarity between Europeans and natives. The deployment of the South African Native Labour Corps did not last until the end of the war. Unlike the other South African soldiers and labourers, including the colours, originally the SAN-LC contracts were a total of 12 months. It was rationally deducted in November 1917 that existing labour was only available for 9 months after deduction of journey time, hence the proposition of 12 months from landing in France. By the time 3,432 members of the SNLE had already returned to the Union after serving their 12-month contracts. This short duration of service was due to administrative and financial burdens and undermined the effectiveness of the actual labour force in France. Furthermore, recruiters facing an existing lack of enthusiasm for the contingent reported to Native Affairs that, for proposals for enlisting natives for the duration of the war plus an additional 6 months, as was customary, would particularly terminate for recruiting of the contingent of South Africa. Confusion over policy was evident by the 3rd of December when Native Affairs issued an instruction to recruiters to change service to the norm of the duration of the war plus 6 months thereafter. However, a second memorandum instructed, "You are therefore requested to take immediate steps to stop recruiting. All persons, both European and native, engaged in recruiting should immediately withdraw from this duty." On the 15th of December, Botha, after consultation with his senior members of Native Affairs, sent a circular to all magistrates and administrators of the South African Native Labour Corps. Army Council concurs that the view of difficulties of maintaining compound systems, all recruiting should be stopped. Although both Chinese and Egyptians are compounded, the restrictions are not nearly as rigorous carried out by the former, the South African Native Labour Corps, while on the latter was negligible for quantity. All contracts were ordered to be cancelled and all men paid accordingly before they were sent home. On the 4th of January 1918, Botha issued the official statement for the widest distribution of the termination of the South African Native Labour Corps. At the time, the strength of the South African Native Labour Corps in France was 11,394. And although the Union of South Africa had serious concerns over the health of its indigenes in foreign environments, as all dominions did, death within the South African Native Labour Corps during the after period were as low as to give 607 men died in 1917, in the Medi sinking alone. In total, 1,107 men of the 25,000 men who enlisted in the South African Native Labour Corps had died. Victory. All Dominion indigenous soldiers were awarded the standard Imperial War Medal and the Victory Medal, save for the black South Africans. While South African colours and blacks from the British protectorates received 2 decorations, although the whites received the medals in silver and the non-whites in bronze, blacks from South Africa did not. The black veterans had law complaints as late as 1971. However, the final decision to withhold medals from the blacks were taken in 1925. Ironically, in December 1918, unaware that the black members of the South African Native Labour Corps would not receive imperial honours, Pritchard for the names of 92 blacks submitted within the recommendations which were appropriate for the recognition for their services and may be granted to them. As a result, 6 black men were awarded the Meritorious Service Medals, their names being published in the London Gazette on the 3rd of June 1919. Coloured South Africans of the Cape Corps were also awarded 16 Distinguished Conduct Medals, 8 military medals, and 34 mentions in dispatches. However, Grunding concluded that there is no satisfactory evidence that the ex-contingent, the South African Native Labour Corps members, were the vanguard of the sustained and coherent black resistance for white dominance. For example, no indicators could be found that the former members were involved in black industrial unrest, nor does it appear, though somewhat different at any levels, that veterans acted in a modernizing with the rural society. Ultimately, then, military service was not a circular veteran of the determined political behavior. Governor General Buxton declared in December 1918 that the war has proven that you and your loyalty will be well placed, and I can assure you that you will not be forgotten. However, black contributions to the war effort were quickly forgotten and policies of segregation were now to be amplified. Veterans were denied access to all and any soldier veteran programs, including education, adequate health care, and the customary monetary discharge of expenditure. The unequal treatment of black veterans led A.K. Ansbuzna to conclude that the treaty that "I'm just like the stone which after killing the bird nobody bothers about. Nobody cares to see where it falls. Following the Great War, the social, economical, and the political conditions for natives in South Africa deteriorated, so bad that even to a greater extent the indigenes of other dominions were treated better than those of South Africa. Add on for the black South Africans, Nelson Mandela was actually born in 1918 at the end of the war, and even though he may proceed in terrorist activities for a non-apartheid South Africa, he will still become one of the nation's founding fathers, the first black president, of course. And actually, P.W. Botha, the Groot Crocodile, was born in 1916, so they were not born too far apart. And actually, if you think about it, Nelson Mandela became president in 1994. Botha was born in 1916, while the grandson of Louis Botha, P.W. Botha, was born in 1916, and Nelson Mandela was born 2 years later, and Nelson Mandela was elected in 1994, and the apartheid government ended officially in 1991-1992. X-Files music plays in the background while we try to figure this out. But anyway, hope you learned something. That's one of the notable African leaders to come out of World War One, well, born in World War One time period. So yeah, I did this just to put Nelson Mandela in here, because why not? Anyway, hope you learn something, hope you do something, and I need to work on a catchphrase or something. Learn something.